You don't always know a future classic when you see it. Some movies take time to permeate the public consciousness and reveal their magnitude of influence. Every era of filmmaking has a movie that quietly shifts the tectonic plates of pop culture before anyone realizes it. A film that looks, feels, and moves like a product of its time, such that you take it for granted. In the 90s, there were the obvious totemic works, more or less canonized upon their release: Terminator 2, Jurassic Park, and The Matrix. But there were also certain films we can only pinpoint as massively influential with decades of perspective, that flew a bit under the radar. Chief among this latter designation was 1998's Blade. Yeah, the Marvel movie with Wesley Snipes and the vampires. More than that, Blade was the film that bridged two cinematic eras: the slow but inevitable death of the quintessential 90s action hero at the turn of the century, and the dawn of the modern superhero film. It's a film about race, class, control, and vengeance, the sort of ideas that would come to animate our more politically minded present. It's also a film about leather coats and pulsating techno with guys who say shit like,
"Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill."
Blade is fucking cool, man. It's so fucking cool. It was cool when it came out, and it's even cooler now. But the thing that makes it fucking cool is Wesley Snipes.
Came back to finish you off.
From the moment he steps into that underground vampire nightclub, dripping in black leather and armed with more weaponry than should be physically possible to carry, Snipes doesn't just play the character. He is Blade in every conceivable way. His performance doesn't feel like an actor trying to embody a comic book character. It's no wonder that for nearly 3 decades it's been impossible to separate the actor from the character. Snipes defines Blade completely, his physicality and personality becoming so intrinsically linked to the cinematic version of the vampire hunter that any attempt to reimagine the character must contend with his shadow. Well, that and Kevin Feige, because we're just wasting Mahershala Ali's time. But yeah, that's for another video.
There's only been one Blade. There's only ever gonna be one Blade.
What makes this casting even more significant is how it represents a critical transition point in the medium. Blade marks the shift from action heroes, who were, if you think about it, sort of unofficial comic book heroes in their own right, commanding the box office, to actual superheroes taking over that cultural real estate. Consider the action stars of the 80s and 90s, Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Van Damme, all those guys. These were larger-than-life figures who performed impossible feats, spouted memorable catchphrases, and dominated theaters through sheer force of personality and physicality. They were heroes, but they existed in a quasi-realistic world where their extraordinary abilities needed at least a thin veneer of plausibility. And by thin, I mean like paper thin. Then, Blade arrives in 1998, straddling both worlds. It has its fangs in the jugular of the muscle-bound one-liners from Schwarzenegger and Stallone, but it also siphons blood from the cape shit that would soon dominate blockbuster filmmaking. Blade was where action heroes became comic book heroes, and it created the template for what would follow. The film is thoroughly a late 90s movie, drenched in the aesthetic sensibilities of the era, the industrial techno soundtrack, the rave culture influences, the obsession with sleek black leather, the embrace of practical stunts and early CGI effects. Yet, it never feels dated because it commits so fully to its vision. Director Stephen Norrington and screenwriter David S. Goyer understood that if you treat the source material with the respect that you would any other literary adaptation, and do so with confidence and conviction, you could overcome the hurdle of people guffawing at the idea of a comic book movie. While Blade is absolutely an action movie to its core, many of its best lines revealed something else entirely.
Well, you already met Mr. Crispy at the hospital.
Who said I was a vampire?
Nobody. There are worse things out tonight than vampires.
Like what?
Like me.
Yes, they're action hero one-liners, but they're also lines ripped right out of the panels of a Blade comic book before he delivered
1,000 gods!
unto his victims. Snipes took the persona and prominence of the late 20th century action hero and applied it to comic book characters, establishing the blueprint for what aught superheroes on the silver screen would become. iconic, if not definitive casting for some of the biggest heroes in all of comics, where the actors' physicality and personality helped fully define the cinematic versions of these characters, despite an aesthetic aversion to their comic booky roots. You know how Robert Downey Jr. and Tony Stark eventually became inseparable, or how Hugh Jackman and Wolverine basically merged into one cultural identity? Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man, Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart as Magneto and Professor Xavier, versions of characters we're still having reprise their roles today because it's damn near impossible to imagine anyone else. We think of these actors and their tethers to their respective heroes with the same reverence we once reserved for the action stars of previous decades. Long before Hollywood figured out how to build billion-dollar superhero franchises around actors who embodied their characters, Blade did it with one man in a pair of sunglasses, aptly walking between both worlds, the comic book movie and the action movie, serving as the bridge that made that transition possible. While peer films and franchises were trying desperately to mint icons in the public consciousness, Wesley Snipes did it with seemingly minimal effort. And the good news is that you too can effortlessly level up that brain of yours with a little help from our friends at Brilliant. If you guys have watched the channel for any period of time, you know that I love Brilliant. They are my favorite platform for learning new skills that are tailored to the way that you retain information. Whether it's math, science, programming, data, or even an occasional brain teaser to start your day, Brilliant helps you become a better thinker and problem solver by helping you build concepts from the ground up. Crafted by an award-winning team of the brightest teachers, researchers, and professionals from Stanford, MIT, Caltech, Google, and more, Brilliant's lessons are designed to help develop your critical thinking skills through problem solving, not memorization. No more long lecture videos. Each lesson is designed and filled with hands-on problem solving for a wide range of concepts, from solving equations, digital circuits, programming with functions, logic, and more. So what are you waiting for? Give Brilliant a try and see that there are ways to learn that are easier than trying to ice skate uphill. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/filmspeak, scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description below. Brilliant's also given our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. That's brilliant.org/filmspeak, or scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description below, and also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. And thank you so much to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. In hindsight, there's something meta about Blade being the first one out the gate. A story that deals with a hero who is himself monstrous, a vampire, a costumed vigilante, a freak, in the eyes of normal people, if you will, conflicted about whether to continue working in the shadows or make himself more visible. He could potentially gain more popularity and be more effective working openly with humans, but is humanity ready to accept him? The same question applied to comic book films at the time. Was the world ready to fully embrace their comic book isms, or were they better off downplaying them? Fortunately for Blade, it got to have its cake and eat it too, embracing the origins while firmly couching itself in the action genre, a balance other films at the time, Singer's X-Men, Daredevil, Ghost Rider, to name a few, would struggle to strike, often shying away from their roots out of self-consciousness.
What would you prefer? Yellow spandex?
You know, the gritty, self-serious comic book film that defined the early 2000s. We owe much of that trend to Blade, but only because the filmmakers who followed didn't recognize that Blade worked because of the nature of the character. We always think of it as an action film first and a comic book movie second, but truthfully, upon rewatch, it occupies both spaces fully. With style, man. And Blade has style to spare. Beyond its historical significance, the film is simply the epitome of cool. It's so fucking effortless. The film never apologizes for its premise, never winks at the audience to assure them it knows how ridiculous vampire hunting should seem. It's stylish without being overly stylized. Or rather, it's stylized in a way that feels organic to its world rather than superficial or imposed. When Blade walks into a room, we believe he's the deadliest thing there, not because the film tells us, but because every aspect of the production design, cinematography, and Snipes' performance convinces us completely. The opening sequence especially is a banger for the ages, man. You know what I'm getting into, right? Just pure tone setter. There's a club of vampires partying like it's 1999. I'm so sorry, you gotta permit me to be a hack from time to time. They're jamming to the boom of techno when the sprinklers suddenly shower them with blood. It's an utterly electrifying moment that somehow swells to an impossible mass when Blade steps through the door. Instantly mythical. The movie tells you everything you need to know without exposition. There's an underground society that vampires rule with abandon, and they have spaces that support their lifestyle, but they also have a boogeyman. Fucking Blade. Blade enters the vampire nightclub like the man with no name, an outlaw figure straight out of spaghetti western, and what follows is a masterclass in economic storytelling. In a few short minutes, we understand the underground war he's fighting, the rules of this universe, and exactly who Blade is. He's presented as a more violent Batman, a vigilante with a flexible moral code who will absolutely kill if necessary, but who operates according to a consistent internal logic. The film's visual language constantly reinforces its Western influences. So many shots are instantly reminiscent of Sergio Leone. The extreme close-ups, the standoffs, the way the characters are framed. When Blade faces down a group of vampires, the composition and tension echo for a few dollars more as much as any superhero comic. The Western influence is perfect for this material because Westerns are ultimately about individuals confronting corrupt systems, about lone heroes standing against organized evil. Every shot of Blade walking through the carnage he's created, slow, deliberate, silhouetted against flickering lights, evokes the mythical loneliness of the gunslinger. He's the man who can never stop fighting because peace would mean confronting what he's lost. In a world with innumerable obstacles, it's one battle after another. David S. Goyer's script builds a mythology that feels ancient and industrial at the same time. Oftentimes, a sort of techno-modernity can mute the grandeur we associate with high fantasy, but here, it's a perfect marriage. These vampires don't lurk in castles, they own nightclubs and banks. They have offshore accounts and political influence. They're an elite shadow aristocracy pulling the strings of modern society, and the sheer magnitude of influence and control adds to the menace. They don't just prey on humanity, they own it. All of this is established within the first, 10 or so minutes. It's goddamn impressive. The film trusts its audience to keep up without excessive exposition, doling out information organically through action and dialogue. I mean, the climax is some of the sickest shit ever put to film, taking the concept of fight choreography as dance choreography and making it literal, with Blade engaging the baddies and eventually Deacon Frost in a battle that's as much about rhythm and movement as violence. The third act in general may be a bit flimsy, the resolution feels rushed, and the epilogue somewhat tacked on, but that's part of the film's charm. Blade is a rough, imperfect movie that succeeds because of its commitment and its heart. Not despite its flaws, but in some ways because of them. It feels dangerous and inspired in ways that more carefully calculated films don't. This rawness, this refusal to sand down all the edges is part of what makes the film's emotional moments land with such an unexpected force. For all its style and action, Blade never forgets that at its center is a man struggling with his own nature. That struggle manifests early in Blade's saving of Dr. Karen Jensen. Blade sees his mother in her, someone who didn't ask for the fate that befell them, and he pities her. He'll try to do what he can to help her, to end her suffering mercifully. This immediately establishes that Blade is more than just a vigilante. He's a hero, someone capable of empathy and compassion even while waging a brutal war. It's a subtle distinction, but an essential one, especially for a character like this. The difference between someone who fights because they enjoy violence and someone who fights because they believe it's necessary. When Blade brings Karen to his lair after rescuing her, it actually reminded me of a scene that would appear years later in Batman Begins, when Bruce Wayne tries to save Rachel Dawes from Scarecrow's fear toxin. Blade doesn't want his curse to become someone else's problem. He could simply let Karen die or turn, eliminating a potential threat, but instead, he chooses to save her, to come out of the shadows and do a bit of good. It's these choices that define him as a hero rather than just a monstrous killer. And that's not the only precursor to Batman Begins. The dynamic between Blade and his mentor weapons manufacturer Whistler, played by the perfectly gruff and cowboy-esque Chris Christopherson, is a first go at his interpretation of the Bruce Wayne and Alfred Pennyworth relationship, but, filtered through a much grittier, more underground aesthetic. Whistler serves as Blade's anchor to humanity, the person who helped pull him out of depravity, the voice of hard-won wisdom, and the only person Blade seems to truly trust. Their relationship provides the emotional core that prevents the film from becoming, a series of action set pieces. Opposite Chris Christopherson, Wesley Snipes delivers remarkably convincing and emotional moments, particularly when Whistler is bitten by Frost's goons and left for dead, or undead? He begs Blade to give him his gun so he can spare him from the misery. The subtlety, nuance, and pain in Snipes' performance makes it so goddamn moving. He's being asked to let the only friend and father figure he's ever known die. The one person who understood his crusade with the power to pierce his icy exterior. As Blade begins to let others in, Whistler, obviously, but more importantly, Karen, he realizes he's not alone in this fight. Whistler provides him with a serum that keeps his thirst at bay, and Karen, using her knowledge as a hematologist, helps Blade search for a cure to their curse while developing more effective weapons against vampires. Karen refuses to give up hope, regardless of what Whistler or Blade says about the impossibility of a cure. For them, the only way out is through violence, through completing the mission. Karen represents the possibility of another path, even if that path seems impossibly distant. Perhaps it's the marriage of the two, the determination and action of people like Blade and Whistler, and the possibility of hope, advancements, and non-violent reactions that will produce real results. Karen is the scientist who sees beyond Blade's armor. She represents a kind of rational compassion, someone who doesn't see a monster, but a man worth saving. Her optimism forces Blade to confront his fatalism. He's been struggling to reconcile with his nature, but she helps him realize it's not something to fight, but to embrace. His ability to walk between worlds and recognize his humanity outweighs his unquenchable thirst is his greatest strength.
A cold heart is a dead heart.
Blade has fortified himself emotionally, finding only utility in people. But we all know that he cares more than he lets on. There's love inside him, genuine care and motivation to help others. He just struggles to reconcile that warmth with the brutality of his life and the violence his crusade requires. For Blade, his crusade is personal. His origin story is soaked in trauma. He was literally born from violence because his mother was attacked by a vampire while pregnant. That infection gives him his powers, but also curses him with eternal thirst. It's a perfect metaphor for inherited pain, for generational trauma that mutates into strength and rage. Blade was swallowed by the system, living on the streets, another victim of institutional neglect, and sent on a path of vengeance. But what separates Blade from a simple revenge story is, for as much as he sees himself as a monster, his humanity remains intact. He hates what he is, but his curse has also given him the experience and empathy needed to effectively combat vampires. His will to tear down the system so that what happened to him doesn't happen to others is stronger than his curse. That's what makes him a tragic hero. Blade channels his pain into purpose, but it isolates him. He's a soldier who can't rest and whose body is a constant reminder of what he's lost. This tension between humanity and monstrosity isn't just personal, it's systemic. Blade's curse came from vampires, but those vampires? Yeah, they're not just supernatural predators. They're stand-ins for something much more insidious, much more real. The film uses the vampire metaphor to explore institutional power and, in so doing, fundamentally changed how vampires were portrayed in pop culture. Blade moves away from the gothic romanticism that had once dominated the genre and towards something more modern and political. While vampires in every movie monster has always been allegorical, by throwing out large portions of the playbook, Goyer makes the vampire feel contemporary. It's a story about class, race, systemic power controlled by a secret underground society resulting in institutional corruption. The vampires are the establishment, literally draining the blood of the people below them, and Blade is the resistance. It shares a lot of thematic overlap with contemporary films like Dark City and The Matrix, about hegemonic power structures and a chosen one who can sever the puppet master's strings. Blade established a template that would inspire films like Underworld and 30 Days of Night, where vampires represented the system rather than individual predators. As I mentioned earlier, the vampires themselves are presented as the ultimate elitists, with offshore accounts and control over politics, finance, and real estate. They are society's succubi, preying on the lower classes to perpetuate their existence.
They own the police. They're everywhere. Chances are you've seen them yourself and didn't know it.
They rule from the shadows rather than drawing attention to themselves, understanding that real power doesn't need to announce itself. And actually, when you do announce yourself, it comes with some strings attached that you probably don't want.
Amateurs seek the sun, get eaten. Power stays in the shadows.
Blade takes the aristocratic trappings of Dracula, the need for dominance and control, and modernizes them completely. The film asks, who are the real bloodsuckers controlling our world today? How do we combat them in our everyday lives? These questions give Blade a political potency that most superhero films lack. When you start thinking about it that way, Blade and Whistler start to look less like a monster hunting duo and more like urban revolutionaries. They live in a world where vampires and humans clash in the streets with echoes of 90s police brutality. Their crusade isn't just personal, they're political. The vampires even have the cops in their pockets. The familiars, as they're called, are humans who serve their masters for scraps of power. It's an image that feels uncomfortably resonant, depicting the people sworn to protect the public, instead acting as the enforcers of an elite class. In many ways, Blade sets the stage for what would become Batman's war against law enforcement and institutional corruption in the Nolan trilogy. But Blade is more socially charged because it carries the baggage of the 90s race riots and the war against police brutality, and its protagonist is a powerful black man revolting against institutions that refuse to view him as a person, that seek to exploit him and vilify him simultaneously. Rewatching Blade with knowledge of what came after reveals how much it influenced subsequent comic book films, particularly the Fox X-Men franchise and Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy. The Goyer connection to Batman makes sense, but the ideas he's exploring here represent a synthesis of X-Men and Batman. The tension between hiding and coexistence that would define the X-Men films is already present in Blade, as is the question of how much a hero should work within or against existing power structures that we see both in X-Men and the Dark Knight trilogy. At the center of this world is Deacon Frost, played with sociopathic charm by Stephen Dorff, the ambitious outsider who doesn't want to dismantle the system, but dominate it. Consequences be damned. He's the new money disruptor in a world of power that hides in the shadows, presenting a compelling foil for Blade. The Order of the Vampires is upheld by the Purebloods, an elite 1%. Frost, on the other hand, was turned into a vampire and thus has something to prove. He's not a pureblood vampire, yet he acts more puritanical and extreme than any member of the Vampire Council. He has a supremacy complex born from insecurity, desperately needing to be taken seriously by the purebloods who look down on him, and so he overcompensates with recklessness and prejudice toward humans. He stokes fears of vampire extinction, positioning himself as the savior his kind needs. He's just a brat who thinks he's a messiah and doesn't give a shit about human rules because vampires are clearly superior. The Vampire Council, meanwhile, thinks things are business as usual, comfortable in their power and the status quo, and it's this complacency that allows for someone and the ideology they represent to fester and become far more dangerous. By running vampire nightclubs and drawing unwanted attention to their kind, Frost poses a threat from within. The vampires have existed in the shadows for thousands of years, puppeteering humanity from behind the curtain. But Frost doesn't understand why they should abide by humanity's rules when they are clearly superior beings. Blade's presence disrupts the vampires' comfortable world, putting pressure on their society that causes the council to turn to someone like Frost out of desperation, even though his methods threaten everything they've built. Due to the fact that he was turned and therefore was once a human, he has the arrogance and narcissism of humanity mixed with the supremacy complex of vampires. The pureblood vampires understand that they control more by operating behind the scenes, having infiltrated society's cornerstones to rule inconspicuously. But Frost, this fanatic with a massive chip on his shoulder, needs attention, needs people to know that he's a superior being. He frames it as a coming out party, the arrival of vampire kind, but it's really just about validation for himself. When Frost begins using the Vampire Bible, the Book of Erebus, to enact control over the natural world through ancient ritual, he becomes a stand-in for elitist religious zealots imposing their will on everyone else because they feel that they need to. They need to have some sort of validation in their beliefs. Even the ending echoes Raiders of the Lost Ark with its supernatural horror elements, New Age fanatics, fascists using ancient mythology to gain power beyond their understanding. Frost sees his power merely as a means to selfishly do whatever he wants. He covets Blade's ability to walk among people during the day, to truly be part of both worlds. Though he sees himself as a monster, Blade stands alongside humanity. Frost, also having ties to humanity, doesn't. He sees humans as cattle, resources to be consumed. In Blade, Frost sees a servant, a slave who can get him what he wants. There's even the detail that Frost has to put on makeup to go outside during the day, whereas Blade doesn't. He's authentic. There's nothing phony about him, no performance required. He doesn't need to exploit or covet anything. He doesn't change who he is to attain status. He's fundamentally altruistic in his mission. He's just Blade. Frost and Blade represent two people who are victims of the same system but make radically different choices. Frost, turned into a vampire rather than born as one, is forever denied the status of pureblood, so he seeks to control the system, to wield it as he wants, to prove himself superior. He's new money trying desperately to be accepted or overtake old money. Blade, meanwhile, opposes the entire structure altogether. He recognizes that the system itself is evil, and no amount of power within it justifies perpetuating it. This is a fundamental ideological divide, and it makes their conflict about much more than your standard superhero fare. Even in Frost's imagined vampire utopia, there would be a class structure, likely one rigged against ordinary vampires who weren't close to power. We see Karen's former colleague chained in a tomb, presumably alongside other humans turned vampires. So, while Frost claims to be a disruptor, new money, he's really just old money in new clothes. He just wants a system that favors him above all else, one where he's at the top of the hierarchy instead of near the bottom. Frost is essentially a class traitor and a Blade fanboy who only sees Blade as a disruptor, as someone who's just kind of going around there and doing whatever he wants without really understanding why he's doing that. He only sees utility and strength in Blade's abilities and weapons. He covets what Blade has, not understanding that Blade's power comes from his humanity as much as from his curse. The plot also reinforces this reading. Frost needs the blood of a Daywalker to trigger an apocalyptic ritual that will transform all humans into vampires, essentially destroying the natural order. They need to exploit Blade to control him and use him against his will and his kind. And this brings us to the most potent level of Blade's political commentary, the way it explicitly engages with race and class in ways most comic book films wouldn't dare. The racial and class commentary in Blade becomes increasingly impossible to ignore as the film progresses. When Frost calls Blade an Uncle Tom, it clarifies everything about his character. He's simply a supremacist trying to exploit Blade, much like so many in marginalized communities are presented with choices that might help them advance individually, accumulating wealth, status, access, but at the expense of their communities. And we know the system is ultimately rigged against people of color and other minorities, so even these individual gains are conditional and temporary. This also ties nicely into the reveal that Blade's mother is still alive and serving Frost willingly. She's become the very thing Blade fought against, a traitor. She sold out her own community because it benefited her, because
Sooner or later, the thirst always wins.
But Blade believes in more than that, more than animalistic impulses. The conflict between them represents his final choice between his vampire nature and his humanity. He must kill his mother, or at least this false version of his mother corrupted by vampirism, in order to free himself from any remaining doubt about where he belongs. When Frost tells Blade,
It's a shame, you know? When I think of what you've become, it's the human side of you that's made you weak. You should have listened to your blood.
he's fundamentally misunderstanding who Blade is. Blade's blood is human. That's the point. Yes, it's mixed. He's half human, but he's still human, and that's the point. His strength comes from refusing to give in to his vampire nature, from maintaining his humanity against all odds. Blade was never part of the vampire community by choice. They didn't even accept him into their ranks. The only reason he is what he is because a vampire attacked his mother, inadvertently imbuing him with their strengths and none of their weaknesses, except for the thirst for human blood. Blade shares far more with his actual community, the one he was born into, despite being cursed by an assault on his mother. He's more like a bastard child of a wealthy elite. You could even read what happened to his mother as a sexual assault by a wealthy and powerful figure. Blade is technically parts of two worlds, but one is objectively evil and the other is where he truly belongs. The film is about fully embracing and strengthening his humanity, or within the film's allegorical framework, his blackness and his class identity. Blade's very existence challenges the logic of purity. He's the proof that what's mixed, what's hybrid, can be just as powerful as anything the so-called purebloods can imagine. The Vampire Council, composed of ancient European purebloods, clearly calls to mind the colonial origins of vampire mythology. Frost, in his spoiled bad boy impulsiveness, obviously represents white privilege while attempting to appropriate Blade's culture and power for his own ends. The vampires constantly talk about being a master race, and Blade is challenged throughout about being mixed race, about not being pure. The blaxploitation iconography that Blade employs feels like a reclamation of that aesthetic after it was largely appropriated and diluted during the late 80s and 90s. Whistler, for his part, sees an opportunity through Blade to make things right. He's an ally who has also suffered at the hands of vampires. They killed his family, and he channels that pain into purpose by training and equipping Blade. Their partnership is one of mutual necessity that has become genuine affection, representing the kind of cross-racial solidarity necessary to combat systemic oppression. I was also watching the behind-the-scenes featurettes for this, and Goyer mentioned that the AIDS epidemic was an underlying issue he wanted to address with Blade, and that kind of blew my mind because it was something that's so obvious, yet I didn't even consider it while watching. The themes of infected blood, the search for a cure, the social stigma attached to Blade's condition. These elements certainly read as a commentary on the AIDS crisis that devastated communities throughout the 80s and 90s. The idea of purity of blood versus corrupted blood, the desperation for a cure, the way Blade is treated as dangerous and infectious despite being a hero. All of this can be read through the lens of how AIDS patients were treated during the epidemic. While the film's racial and class commentary feels more prominent and intentional, this additional layer enriches the overall experience of watching this movie, adding another dimension to how the film explores marginalization and stigma. What makes all of this political commentary work is that it never feels forced or preachy. Not that that's a bad thing, but it's cool that Blade trusts its audience to pick up on these elements without spelling them out in obvious ways. The vampires are predatory elites. Blade is a revolutionary from the margins. Frost is the opportunist who wants to join the oppressors. These dynamics play out through action and character rather than through exposition. And because the film commits so fully to its genre trappings, the action, the horror, the style, the politics enhance rather than overwhelm the experience. But the film's also smart enough to understand that while Blade may win in the end, one victory doesn't solve everything. Just because Blade defeats Frost doesn't mean injustice is finished. The film's epilogue makes clear that Blade's crusade continues. Blade rejects Karen's cure because the events of the film only serve to galvanize him. He can't have a normal life because the fight isn't over. He heads to Moscow to continue hunting vampires because systemic evil doesn't end with one victory. You have to keep fighting the power to see progress. The refusal of a clean ending, of complete resolution, is remarkably honest about the nature of fighting injustice. Blade understands something that a lot of superhero movies don't. There's no neat resolution to systemic evil. And sure, every modern tentpole cape flick has a button at the end that tells us who our heroes will be fighting next, but this is more than that. It's less about creating IP that can be recycled in perpetuity, but instead grappling with real-world concepts of oppression and division. Beneath all the swagger, and God, Blade has so goddamn much of it. Blade is about a man who can never stop doing what he does because the world will never stop needing him. This understanding that the work is never done, that vigilance is permanent, connects directly back to why Blade mattered so much when it came out. Blade is a rebuttal of the purity and sanitization of comics and comic book films that preceded it. The character himself embodies revolt and rebellion against unjust systems, making it fitting that he was the one to redefine what modern comic book films could be. The success of Blade proved that comic book movies could be dark, they could be violent, politically charged, and still succeed both critically and commercially. It proved that superhero films didn't need to be embarrassed about their source material. They just had to find a way to adapt it. It's almost funny now, watching Blade in a world of billion-dollar superhero universes, to remember that this was once a gamble. The MCU may have memory hold the fact that a project like this was once a box office risk, but there was a time when superhero movies bombed. In 1998, a Marvel property starring a black man directed by an effects artist was radioactive enough to turn the box office into, mutant box office? The point is that this was a major financial risk, making Blade's success even more revolutionary. It proved that comic book movies could be stylish without being camp, serious without being self-serious, and to put it as simply as possible, led by black characters. Snipes' Blade wasn't a sidekick or the comic relief, he was the myth itself. The coolest man alive, fighting monsters that looked a lot like the real world. That's the irony of Blade. It's a film about a half-human outcast made by a system that didn't yet understand how much it needed him. It's easy to take that for granted now, in an era of multiverses and endless franchise cynicism, but in 1998, a film this unapologetically stylish, political, and cool shouldn't have worked. It shouldn't have at all, because Blade wasn't about saving the world, it was about surviving it.